The blood-red sun was sinking fast when Tessa Kingston saw the dust clouds rising in the distance. She clutched her father's pocket watch, her breath catching in her throat. Those riders were coming too fast. Way too fast. Nevada Territory, 1876. Tessa snapped the reins harder, urging her two-horse team forward along the lonely stretch of road. She was only 3 hours from Hamilton, but those dust clouds were gaining ground with terrifying speed. At 23 years old, she'd traveled this route enough times to recognize trouble when she saw it. "Come on, Maple! Come on, Scout!" she shouted, her voice cracking with urgency. The loaded wagon groaned beneath her, carrying supplies for her late father's general store. The store that had become her sole responsibility 4 months ago when typhoid claimed him. Her heart hammered as she glanced back again. The dust cloud had separated into distinct riders. 5 of them. Not a mail coach, not a patrol. Riders with purpose, riding hard straight for her wagon. But here's what Tessa didn't know yet. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. She reached beneath the seat and withdrew the Winchester rifle her father had insisted she learn to shoot. The familiar weight brought little comfort as the first shots rang out behind her. "Halt that wagon!" a rough voice shouted. Tessa did the opposite. She whipped the reins harder, the wagon lurching forward violently. But she knew her heavily laden vehicle couldn't outpace mounted men. It was only a matter of time. A rider pulled alongside, a bandana covering his face below cold, calculating eyes. "Stop or die, lady." Tessa raised the rifle one-handed, but before she could aim, another rider appeared on her left, reaching for her reins. She swung the rifle toward him, but the sudden motion threw her off balance. The man on her right seized the opportunity, grabbing her arm and wrenching the weapon from her grasp. The wagon careened wildly as the horses panicked. Tessa screamed as one of the raiders seized her around the waist, hauling her from the driver's seat with brutal force. She kicked and clawed, fighting with everything she had. Then a sharp blow to her temple sent the world spinning into darkness. What Tessa couldn't have known was that miles away in Hamilton, a man she barely knew was about to become her only hope. Brock Xavier stood at the bar of the Rusty Nail Saloon, nursing a whiskey and contemplating his next move. At 28, he'd spent more years than he cared to count, drifting from one cattle outfit to another, from Texas to Montana, and now Nevada. Hamilton was just another stop, though he'd lingered longer than usual, taking odd jobs and building a reputation as a man who could track anything that left a trace. "Xavier," Sheriff Mills called from the Batwing doors. "Got a moment?" Brock nodded, taking his whiskey with him as he followed the lawman out onto the boardwalk. The sheriff's weathered face looked more lined than usual in the fading daylight. "Kingston girl was due in from Carson City today with supplies," Mills said without preamble. "Stage came in, but she wasn't on it. Shopkeeper says she bought her goods 2 days ago and headed out yesterday morning." "That Tessa Kingston?" Brock asked, though he already knew the answer. Everyone in Hamilton knew Tessa Kingston, strong-willed, independent, determined to make a go of her father's business despite the town's doubts. "The one who runs the mercantile since her pa died?" "That's the one. She's reliable as sunrise. Should have been here by now." The sheriff scratched his graying beard. "Got a bad feeling. There's been talk of raiders hitting supply wagons between here and Carson City. 3 incidents in the past month." Brock drained his whiskey, a decision already forming. "You want me to have a look?" "You're the best tracker in 3 counties, Xavier. I'd go myself, but with my deputy laid up with that broken leg." The sheriff let his words trail off. "I'll head out at first light," Brock said, already mentally preparing for the journey. "Town can pay you $50 if you find her." Brock's jaw tightened. "I'll find her." But what Brock wouldn't admit to the sheriff, barely admitted to himself, was that he'd noticed Tessa Kingston from the first day he'd arrived in Hamilton 3 months ago. Her determined stride as she hauled crates into the mercantile. The way sunlight caught her auburn hair when she rode through town. The rare smile she offered customers that transformed her serious face. They'd exchanged few words, mostly when he purchased supplies. But there was something about her that lingered in his thoughts, something that made this rescue mission feel deeply personal in ways he couldn't quite explain. What neither of them knew yet was that their lives were about to become permanently, irrevocably intertwined. Dawn broke with Brock already 2 hours on the trail, his dun gelding eating up the miles as he scanned the ground for signs. He traveled light, bedroll, canteen, jerky, ammunition, and his faithful Colt, 45 on his hip. His Winchester rode in a scabbard beneath his knee. By midday, he found the first evidence of trouble. Wagon tracks veering suddenly off the main trail, accompanied by multiple hoofprints. Brock dismounted, crouching to study the ground with practiced eyes. 5 riders, moving fast. The wagon had picked up speed here too, the wheels cutting deeper into the dirt. She'd tried to run. Following the chaotic trail, Brock rode another mile before discovering what made his blood run cold. The abandoned wagon lay on its side, one wheel shattered, contents scattered across the ground like a battlefield. Flour sacks had burst open, creating a ghostly white blanket over the earth. Crates had splintered, spilling canned goods and tools everywhere. Of Tessa Kingston, there was no sign. Brock dismounted, his hand resting on his pistol as he surveyed the scene. Blood speckled the driver's seat. Not much, but enough to tighten his chest with concern. He found Tessa's Winchester lying in the dirt, unfired. The tracks told a story only he could read. 5 riders approached, surrounded the wagon, took the driver. Then they'd split up. 2 riders heading north with the wagon horses, 3 others heading southeast. 1 horse carrying double weight. They'd taken Tessa. Brock's jaw clenched as he knelt by those tracks, reading the signs like words on a page. The southeast trail led toward the rugged foothills of the Toyabe Range. Rough country, outlaw country. Returning to his horse, Brock withdrew a small metal tin from his saddlebag. Inside was a faded daguerreotype, Tessa Kingston standing beside her father in front of their store. He'd found it among the scattered goods, the frame cracked, but the image intact. He tucked it into his shirt pocket before swinging back into the saddle. "Let's go, Thunder," he murmured to his horse. "We've got tracks to follow." But what Brock didn't know was that Tessa was already making plans of her own, and those plans were about to make his rescue mission far more complicated than he ever imagined. Tessa woke to pain throbbing behind her eyes and rough hands binding her wrists. Disoriented, she tried to make sense of her surroundings. A small clearing in thick brush, 3 men arguing nearby. The smell of a campfire cutting through the evening air. "Waste of time," one was saying. "Wagon's busted, goods are scattered. All we got is the horses and her." "She's worth something," another replied, his voice cold and calculating. "Town will pay for her return, or that fancy-pants banker might. Heard he's sweet on her." Tessa kept her eyes nearly closed, feigning unconsciousness as she assessed her situation. Her head pounded where she'd been struck, and her bound hands had already lost feeling. But her mind was racing. These men weren't ordinary thieves. They were calculating, organized raiders who had been watching the trail, watching her. "She's awake," the third man said suddenly, moving toward her. "Ain't you pretty, lady?" Tessa opened her eyes fully, refusing to show fear despite the terror clawing at her throat. "People will come looking for me." The man crouched before her, his breath foul with tobacco and whiskey. "Counting on it. Question is, how much are you worth to them?" "Not as much as you think," Tessa answered steadily. "I'm just a storekeeper. The man closest to the fire, clearly the leader, approached. "Kingston Mercantile, only general store in Hamilton. Your pa built it up good before he died. Now it's all yours, ain't it? Bet that makes you quite valuable." Tessa's blood ran cold. They knew her name, her business. They'd been planning this. "Town's struggling since the silver ran thin," she said carefully. "Nobody has money for ransoms." The leader laughed. "We'll see. Mendez, you and Reeves head to the meeting point tomorrow. I'll take our guest to the cabin. We'll send our demands once you're in position." Tessa's mind raced. They were splitting up. If she was taken to some remote cabin, any chance of rescue would diminish rapidly. "Why not just take what you wanted from the wagon?" she asked, playing for time, for information, for any advantage. "Why take me?" "Times are changing," the leader said. "Goods get found or rot, but people can bring steady money. And a woman running a business alone?" His smile was cruel. "Hamilton will pay to get you back, or maybe we find other buyers farther south." A chill ran through Tessa that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. She'd heard whispers of women disappearing along the frontier, of trafficking rings taking them to mining camps or across the border. But here's what none of these men realized. Tessa Kingston wasn't the helpless victim they assumed her to be. She was already planning her survival, already thinking 3 steps ahead, already preparing to leave a trail for anyone smart enough to follow. And somewhere out there in the wilderness, Brock Xavier was tracking her with a determination that would soon prove unstoppable. The ground spoke to Brock, telling him stories with every displaced stone, bent grass blade, and disturbed soil. 3 hours on the trail, and the signs remained clear. 3 horses, one carrying double weight, heading into increasingly difficult terrain. They'd been careless at first, confident no one would follow immediately. But as the day wore on, Brock noticed attempts to hide their trail, crossing rocky patches, doubling back across streams. Amateur tactics. They hadn't counted on someone with his tracking skills. By late afternoon, Brock had covered nearly 30 miles, pushing Thunder harder than he liked. The trail led into a narrow canyon where the signs indicated the riders had stopped to rest. A discarded coffee tin, still with traces of heat when he tested it with the back of his hand. They were close, very close. Brock dismounted, leading Thunder to a small stream to drink while he surveyed the area. Something caught his eye, a scrap of blue fabric snagged on a thorny bush. He recognized the pattern from a dress he'd seen Tessa wearing in town just last week. A deliberate sign, or accident. Either way, it confirmed he was on the right track. The sun was setting when Brock decided to make camp, finding a sheltered spot where he could rest without lighting a fire that might alert the raiders to his presence. He ate jerky and hardtack, washing it down with water, his thoughts on what lay ahead. If they were taking Tessa into the mountains, it meant they likely had a hideout there. Not good. Mountains meant caves, cabins, 100 places to disappear. And if they reached their destination before he caught up... Brock checked his weapons methodically, counting his ammunition. 15 rounds for the Winchester, 6 for the Colt, plus what he carried in his saddlebags. It would have to be enough. He'd faced outlaws before, in his years drifting from Texas to Montana, serving briefly as a deputy in Wyoming before the wanderlust took him again. But this felt different. This wasn't about a bounty or a job. This was about Tessa Kingston and the quiet strength he'd admired from afar. First light, he promised himself, settling back against his saddle. We'll find her by first light. But what Brock didn't know was that Tessa was already leaving him breadcrumbs, and those breadcrumbs were about to lead him into a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. Tessa spent a miserable night, her body aching from the rough ride and her uncomfortable position against a tree. By dawn, the raiders were already breaking camp. The leader, she'd heard the others call him Silas, roughly pulled her to her feet. "Time to move, Miss Kingston," he said, cutting her ankle bindings but keeping her wrists secured. "We've got a nice cozy cabin waiting. You be good, and this will all be over in a few days." "And if I'm not good?" she challenged, stretching her stiff legs. Silas's expression darkened. "Then things get unpleasant. Your choice." They gave her a small piece of jerky and water before hoisting her onto a horse behind one of the men. As they rode out, Tessa noticed something crucial. The third man was staying behind, covering their tracks. They were being followed. Hope flickered in her chest for the first time since her capture. Someone was coming for her. The sheriff? One of the townspeople? She needed to help whoever it was, to leave signs if possible. As they rode, Tessa watched for opportunities. When they crossed a stream, she managed to slip her father's pocket watch, still in her dress pocket, into the water where its brass case would catch the sunlight. Later, when they stopped briefly to rest the horses, she deliberately tore a piece of her petticoat on a branch while pretending to stumble. Small breadcrumbs, tiny acts of defiance, all she could manage under the watchful eyes of her captors. By midday, the terrain had grown steeper, the trail narrower. They were climbing into the mountains, following game trails too small for regular travelers. Tessa tried to memorize landmarks, an unusual rock formation, a lightning-struck tree, anything that might help her find her way back if the opportunity to escape presented itself. "Expecting company, Silas?" the rider in front asked suddenly, nodding back toward where they'd come from. Silas scowled. "Tucker's watching our back trail, but just in case." He reached for his rifle, aiming at a fallen tree across their path. The shot echoed through the canyon, sending birds scattering from the trees. Rocks dislodged by the sound tumbled down the steep slope beside them. "That ought to slow anyone down," Silas said with satisfaction as the minor rock slide partially obscured the trail behind them. Tessa's heart sank. Her pursuer, if there was one, would have a much harder time following now. After another hour of riding, a small cabin came into view, nestled against a cliff face with a commanding view of the valley below. "Home, sweet home," Silas announced, dismounting and pulling Tessa roughly from the horse. The cabin was small but solidly built, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot in one corner. A trap door in the floor likely led to a root cellar. Gun ports had been cut into the walls at strategic points. This was no random hideout. It was a fortress designed for defense. "Get comfortable," Silas told her, pushing her toward the cot. "You'll be our guest for a few days while we negotiate your worth." Tessa looked around, assessing her prison. No windows except one small opening beside the door, shuttered from the inside. One door, heavily constructed. Even if she could free herself, escape would be nearly impossible. Her only hope lay with whoever was following them, if they were still following at all. What Tessa didn't know was that Brock Xavier had already eliminated one threat and was closing in fast, driven by something far more powerful than a $50 bounty. Brock found the man waiting in ambush just after daybreak. He'd been following the fresh trail when instinct made him pause, sensing something wrong in the too quiet forest. Dismounting, he secured Thunder and proceeded on foot, rifle ready. The bushwhacker was hidden behind a boulder overlooking the trail, rifle trained on the path below, so focused on his task that he failed to notice Brock's silent approach from behind. "Move, and you're dead," Brock said quietly, pressing his Winchester against the man's back. The ambusher froze, then slowly raised his hands. "Don't shoot, mister. Just doing a job." "Drop the rifle. Slow." The man complied, his weapon clattering to the ground. "Turn around." The bushwhacker turned, revealing a weathered face with 3 days' stubble and cold eyes. "You the law?" "Where's the woman?" Brock demanded, ignoring the question. "What woman?" Brock's patience, never abundant, thinned dangerously. "Tessa Kingston, taken from her wagon yesterday. You and your friends. Where?" The man's eyes narrowed with calculation. "Maybe we can deal. I tell you, you let me go." "Maybe I just beat it out of you," Brock countered, his voice deceptively calm. Something in his expression must have convinced the outlaw, because fear flickered across his face. "Cabin up in the Toyabs. Silas has her there." "How many men?" "Just Silas now. Other two headed for the rendezvous point to deliver the ransom note." The man licked his lips nervously. "Look, I just watched the trail. I ain't hurt no woman." "How far to this cabin?" 4-5 hours ride, following the game trail up the East Fork. Brock nodded toward a nearby tree. "Move over there." Once the outlaw was positioned, Brock quickly bound him with his own belt and bandana. He wouldn't waste bullets, but he couldn't let the man warn his companions either. "Someone will be along eventually," Brock told him, gathering both rifles. "Might be the sheriff, might be hungry wolves. Your luck either way." Leaving the trussed outlaw cursing behind him, Brock returned to Thunder and continued his pursuit. The trail was clear now that he knew what he was following. He pushed on relentlessly, pausing only when necessary to water his horse or confirm the direction. Midday brought him to a stream crossing where something caught his eye, a glint of metal in the water. Dismounting, Brock waded in, retrieving a pocket watch. Opening it revealed an inscription. "To Richard Kingston, with love, Elizabeth." Tessa's father's watch, another breadcrumb. She was alive, alert enough to leave signs. The knowledge spurred him forward with renewed determination. An hour later, he heard a distant gunshot, followed by the rumble of falling rocks. Approaching cautiously, Brock discovered a section of trail partially blocked by a small rock slide. A deliberate attempt to slow pursuit. "Getting desperate, aren't they, boy?" he murmured to Thunder as they carefully picked their way through the obstacle. The trail grew steeper, winding through dense forest. Brock watched for signs, finding subtle evidence of Tessa's presence. A torn piece of white fabric that could only be from a woman's undergarments, a clear heel print where she deliberately dug in while dismounting. By late afternoon, he was close enough to proceed with extreme caution. Leaving Thunder secured in a hidden clearing, Brock continued on foot, moving silently through the trees. Years of hunting and tracking had taught him patience and stealth, skills that had saved his life more than once. The cabin came into view as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Brock studied it from cover. Solid construction, defensible position, one visible entrance. A horse was tethered outside, another in a small lean-to stable. Smoke rose from the chimney. Using his field glass, he watched long enough to confirm there appeared to be only two people, a man with a rifle who moved like he was in charge, and a second figure seated near the fire. Tessa. Night would be his ally. Brock settled in to wait, planning his approach. He would have one chance, and Tessa's life depended on him getting it right. But what he didn't know was that Tessa was already working on her own escape plan, and their two plans were about to collide in unexpected ways. Inside the cabin, Tessa watched Silas pace restlessly. Something had him on edge. Tucker should have returned by now, he'd muttered more than once. Her hands remained bound, but her ankles were free, allowing her to move around the small cabin under Silas's watchful eye. He'd made her prepare a simple meal of beans and coffee, standing over her while she worked awkwardly with her bound hands. As darkness fell, Silas grew increasingly agitated, checking his rifle repeatedly and peering out through the gun ports. Tessa's hope grew with his anxiety. Someone was coming. Someone who had already eliminated Tucker, judging by Silas's concern. "Your friend isn't coming back," she said finally, unable to resist the small victory. Silas turned on her with a snarl. "Shut your mouth." "Tucker's just being cautious. Or he's dead," Tessa pressed. "The sheriff would have organized a search party by now. Everyone in Hamilton knows my schedule." It was a bluff. The sheriff was more likely drunk than organizing any search, but Silas didn't need to know that. "Even if they're looking, they won't find this place," Silas retorted, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. "Then why are you so nervous?" Silas crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing her arm roughly. "I said shut up." He pushed her toward the cot. "Lie down and stay quiet, or I'll gag you." Tessa complied, her mind racing. If rescuers were near, she needed to be ready. Using her body to shield her movements from Silas's view, she worked at the bindings on her wrists, rubbing them against the rough wood frame of the cot. The rope was strong, but if she could create even a little slack. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. Silas lit a small lantern, keeping it dim. Every few minutes, he would move to a different gun port to scan the surrounding forest, his movements growing more erratic with each passing hour. The night deepened. Tessa continued her subtle struggle with the ropes, feeling them gradually loosen. Her wrists were raw and bleeding, but she ignored the pain, focusing on creating just enough space to slip one hand free. A sound outside, so faint she almost missed it, made Silas spin toward the door, rifle raised. "Tucker," he called. Silence answered. Silas moved to the window, peering out cautiously. In that moment, Tessa felt the rope give way, one hand slipping free. She kept her position, waiting, watching, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Silas must hear it. "Probably a deer," Silas muttered. But he didn't sound convinced. He returned to the table, sitting with his rifle across his knees, facing the door. Minutes stretched into an hour. Tessa pretended to sleep, her freed hand concealed beneath her body, ready to act if opportunity presented itself. Then everything happened at once. A rock crashed through the window, sending glass shards flying. Silas leapt up, firing blindly toward the sound. In the same instant, the door burst open and a tall figure charged in, tackling Silas before he could aim again. The 2 men crashed into the table, sending it splintering beneath their combined weight. The lantern toppled, oil spilling and igniting, creating chaotic patterns of light and shadow as the men grappled for control of the rifle. Tessa rolled from the cot, pulling her other hand free of the loosened bindings. She looked for a weapon, anything, and spotted Silas's revolver on the shelf where he'd placed it earlier. The fighting men were a tangle of limbs and curses, neither gaining clear advantage. As Tessa lunged for the gun, she recognized Silas's attacker in the flickering firelight. Brock Xavier, the quiet cowboy from Hamilton. She grabbed the revolver, hands shaking as she aimed it at the struggling men. "Brock, move away." He glanced up, saw the gun in her hands, and immediately rolled sideways, giving her a clear shot at Silas. The outlaw snarled, reaching for his boot knife. "You won't shoot, woman. You ain't got the—" Tessa pulled the trigger. The report was deafening in the small cabin. Silas jerked backward, a look of surprise crossing his face as he clutched his shoulder. Brock was on him instantly, delivering a solid punch that rendered Silas unconscious. Only then did he look up at Tessa, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, his breathing heavy. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Tessa lowered the smoking gun, suddenly aware of the burning pain in her wrists, the throbbing in her head, the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. "I'll live," she managed. "You came for me." "I did." Brock stood slowly, moving toward her with caution, as though approaching a spooked horse. "Sheriff asked me to track you. Found your wagon yesterday." He reached for the gun, gently taking it from her trembling hands. Something in that simple action, The care with which he touched her, the respect in his eyes, broke the dam of control Tessa had maintained through her ordeal. She swayed on her feet, and Brock caught her before she could fall, strong arms steadying her. "I've got you," he said softly. "You're safe now." Tessa allowed herself a moment of weakness, leaning against his solid chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Then she straightened, determined not to collapse completely. "The others," she said. "There are 2 more at some meeting point. They're going to demand ransom." Brock nodded, keeping one hand on her arm to steady her while he used his bandana to bind Silas's wound. "We'll deal with them, but first, let's get you out of here." He secured Silas with rope from his own pack, then examined Tessa's bloody wrists with a frown. "These need tending." "Later," she insisted. "I want to leave this place." Brock didn't argue, understanding her need to escape the cabin that had been her prison. He collected their weapons, doused the small fire that had started from the spilled lantern, and led her outside into the cool night air. Tessa breathed deeply, tilting her head back to look at the stars. Freedom had never tasted so sweet. What neither of them realized yet was that this rescue was only the beginning of something far more profound, something that would transform both their lives in ways they never imagined possible. "My horse is this way," Brock said, guiding her through the darkness. "Thunder can carry us both down to safer ground. We'll make camp, tend those wrists, and head for Hamilton at first light." "What about him?" Tessa asked, nodding back toward the cabin. "He's not going anywhere. We'll send the sheriff back for him." Brock's hand remained at her elbow, supporting her over the uneven ground. "Unless you'd rather I bring him along, tied to his horse." "No," Tessa said firmly. "I've seen enough of him." They reached Brock's horse, a sturdy dun gelding that nickered softly as they approached. Brock helped Tessa mount, then swung up behind her, his arms creating a protective circle as he reached for the reins. "You tracked me all this way," Tessa said as they began their descent. "How?" "It's what I do," Brock replied simply. "You left good signs, the watch in the stream, the fabric on the branches. You found those?" Tessa turned slightly, looking up at him in the moonlight. "I wasn't sure anyone would." "I would have found you without them," he said, and something in his voice made her heart beat faster. "But they helped." They rode in silence after that, picking their way carefully down the mountain in the darkness. Thunder seemed to know his job, finding the trail even where it was barely visible in the moonlight. An hour later, Brock located a suitable campsite, a small clearing near a stream, sheltered by overhanging rocks. He helped Tessa dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Rest," he said, gesturing to a fallen log. "I'll get a fire going." Tessa sank gratefully onto the log, watching as Brock efficiently gathered wood and kindled a small flame. The simple domesticity of the act struck her. How many times had she watched her father do the same on their infrequent trips together? But Brock was not her father. He was something else entirely. A man who had tracked her through wilderness and battled an armed outlaw to save her. A man whose quiet strength had been easy to overlook in Hamilton, but was impossible to ignore here. When the fire was crackling steadily, Brock retrieved a canteen and small pouch from his saddlebags. "Let me see those wrists," he said, kneeling before her. Tessa extended her hands, wincing as he gently cleaned the raw skin with water. "These are deep," he observed, his brow furrowed with concern. "Rope was tight. I had to—" She trailed off, remembering the desperate struggle to free herself. Brock nodded, understanding without further explanation. From his pouch, he produced a small tin of salve. "This will help. Hunter I knew up in Montana made it. Bears, bees, all sorts of things up there that leave marks." His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle as he applied the salve, working methodically around her wrists, The ointment smelled of pine and herbs, cooling the burning sensation almost immediately. "Thank you," Tessa said, studying his downturned face as he worked. In the firelight, she noticed details she'd overlooked in their brief encounters in Hamilton. A small scar near his right eyebrow, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar, the fan of lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than she'd realized. Brock finished with her wrists and sat back on his heels, meeting her gaze. "You should try to sleep. We've got a long ride tomorrow." "I don't think I can," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them taking me, the wagon overturning." "Then we'll talk," he said simply, moving to sit beside her on the log. "Until you're ready to rest." "Tell me why you came after me," Tessa said. "The sheriff asked, but you didn't have to accept." Brock was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost confessional. "I've been watching you, Miss Kingston, since I came to Hamilton." "Watching me?" she repeated, unsure whether to be flattered or concerned. He smiled slightly. "Not in a worrying way, just noticing. How you run that store alone. How you help folks who can't afford to pay full price, thinking nobody sees. How you stand straighter when the bank manager comes around, like you're daring him to suggest you can't manage on your own." Heat rose in Tessa's cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "I didn't realize I was so observable. To most, you're not, but I've always noticed details others miss. It's what makes me a good tracker." He glanced at her. "And what makes me see that you're a remarkable woman, Miss Kingston." The compliment, delivered so matter-of-factly, caught Tessa off guard. In Hamilton, she was the spinster storekeeper, a curiosity, a woman running a business alone. No one had called her remarkable, not since her father died. "You can call me Tessa," she said softly. "After today, I think we're beyond formalities." "Tessa," he repeated, as though testing the name. "Then I'm Brock." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. Despite her earlier certainty that sleep would be impossible, Tessa found her eyelids growing heavy, the events of the past 2 days catching up with her. "You should lie down," Brock said, noticing her fatigue. "I've got a bedroll you can use." He spread his bedroll near the fire, then draped his coat over it for additional cushioning. "I'll keep watch. You're safe here." Tessa wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't tired, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. She lay down gratefully, surprised by the comfort of the simple arrangement. "What about the other raiders?" she asked, fighting to keep her eyes open. "You said there were 2 at a meeting point." "We'll reach Hamilton tomorrow. The sheriff can organize a proper posse." Brock added another log to the fire. "For now, rest. That's an order, Miss Kingston." The teasing note in his voice made her smile despite everything. "Not very good at taking orders," she murmured, already drifting. "I've noticed that too," was the last thing she heard before sleep claimed her. What Tessa didn't know as she slept peacefully by the fire was that Brock Xavier was watching her with an expression that spoke of something far deeper than a $50 bounty, something that would soon change both their lives forever. Brock watched Tessa sleep, the firelight casting a warm glow across her face. In repose, the strain of the past days eased from her features, revealing the beauty that her usual serious expression often masked. A strand of auburn hair had fallen across her cheek, and he resisted the unexpected urge to brush it away. Instead, he rose and moved to check on Thunder, unsaddling the horse properly and ensuring he was comfortable for the night. The gelding had earned his rest after the grueling pursuit. When he returned to the fire, Tessa had curled onto her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek. The bandages on her wrists stood out starkly against her skin, reminders of what she'd endured. Brock settled against a tree trunk, rifle across his knees, prepared for a night of vigilance. But his thoughts kept returning to the woman sleeping by his fire, her courage in leaving signs for him to follow, her quick thinking in grabbing the outlaw's gun, the way she had maintained her dignity despite her ordeal. In his years of drifting, Brock had known many women, saloon girls, ranchers' daughters, widows looking for comfort. None had affected him the way Tessa Kingston did, with her quiet strength and fierce independence. Tomorrow they would return to Hamilton, where she would resume running her store, and he would. What? Move on as he always did. The thought brought an unexpected hollowness to his chest. The night passed slowly. Twice Tessa stirred in her sleep, making small sounds of distress. Each time Brock spoke quietly, reassuring her without waking her fully, and she settled again. Dawn broke with mist rising from the stream and birds beginning their morning songs. Brock had just started preparing coffee when Tessa opened her eyes, momentary confusion giving way to recognition as she remembered where she was. "Morning," he said, offering her his canteen. "Sleep all right?" Tessa sat up, accepting the water gratefully. "Better than I expected." She glanced around their small camp, then back at him. "Did you sleep at all?" "I'll sleep in Hamilton," Brock replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "We should reach town by mid-afternoon if we push." After a simple breakfast of jerky and hardtack, they broke camp efficiently, Tessa insisting on helping despite her injured wrists. "I'm not an invalid," she said when Brock tried to take the bedroll from her. "And you've done enough already." He raised his hands in surrender, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. "Never thought you were, Miss Kingston." "Tessa," she reminded him, a small smile softening her expression. "Tessa," he agreed, returning the smile before turning to Saddle Thunder. The descent from the mountains was easier in daylight, though they proceeded cautiously. Brock kept his rifle ready, and Tessa carried Silas's revolver tucked into the pocket of her torn dress. As they rode, Tessa sitting before him in the saddle, Brock found himself increasingly aware of her, the scent of her hair, the warmth of her back against his chest, the way she swayed with Thunder's movements in perfect rhythm with his own body. "Tell me about yourself," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "You know my story. Everyone in Hamilton does. But you're still a mystery, Mr. Xavier." "Not much to tell," Brock replied, adjusting his hold on the reins to avoid brushing against her waist. "Texas-born. Been drifting since the war ended." "The war? You fought?" "Confederate cavalry. Not something I'm proud of now," he admitted. "I was young, following my father's beliefs without questioning them." Tessa was silent for a moment, digesting this. "And after?" "Couldn't go home. Texas had changed. Or maybe I had." He shrugged, the motion pressing him briefly closer to her. "Worked cattle drives to Kansas. Was a deputy in Wyoming for a spell. Did some hunting and trapping in Montana. Ended up in Nevada. No particular reason. Just drifting." Tessa mused. "Don't you ever want to stop? Put down roots somewhere?" The question struck closer to home than she could know. Lately, the constant movement had begun to wear on him. The endless horizon no longer promised adventure, but only more of the same emptiness. "Maybe," he said, more honestly than he'd intended. "If I found the right place, the right reason." She glanced back at him, her eyes searching his face for a moment before turning forward again. "Hamilton's not much, but it has potential. The silver mines are playing out, but there's good cattle land, and with the railroad spur coming through next year—" "You sound like you're trying to sell me a plot of land," Brock observed, amusement coloring his tone. Tessa laughed, the sound unexpectedly musical. "Force of habit, storekeeper's daughter, everything's inventory or opportunity." The laughter transformed her, erasing the last traces of strain from her ordeal. Brock found himself wishing he could make her laugh more often. "I'll consider it," he said, surprised to realize he meant it. They continued their journey, the terrain gradually becoming less steep as they followed a creek downward. By noon, they had reached more familiar country, and Brock recognized landmarks indicating they were less than 2 hours from Hamilton. "We should water Thunder," he suggested, spotting a suitable clearing beside the creek. They dismounted, Brock helping Tessa down with hands that lingered perhaps a moment too long at her waist. If she noticed, she gave no sign, moving to splash cool water on her face while Thunder drank deeply. "I must look a fright," she said, attempting to smooth her tangled hair. "You look alive," Brock replied simply. "That's all that matters." Their eyes met over the rippling water, something unspoken passing between them. Tessa was the first to look away, a flush coloring her cheeks. "We should keep moving," she said, her voice not quite steady. "I want to reach town before dark." Brock nodded, offering a hand to help her rise. This time, when their fingers touched, neither was quick to let go. What neither of them realized was that they were riding toward a future neither had planned, but one that would prove more perfect than anything they could have imagined. The remainder of the journey passed in companionable conversation, Tessa sharing stories of growing up in Hamilton, of her father's dreams for the store, of her own determination to make it succeed despite the town's economic struggles. "Pa always said Hamilton would bounce back," she explained. "He believed in the place and the people. I can't let that faith die with him." "He'd be proud of what you're doing," Brock said quietly. Tessa's expression softened. "Thank you for that. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just being stubborn, holding on when I should sell to that banker who keeps making offers." "Stubborn isn't always bad," Brock observed. "Got you through the last few days, didn't it?" She nodded, considering this. "I suppose it did." The first buildings of Hamilton appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon, the church spire and water tower standing tall against the sky. Tessa straightened in the saddle at the sight, as though drawing strength from the proximity of home. News of their approach traveled quickly. By the time they rode down the main street, a small crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Deputy Williams hobbling on his crutches despite his broken leg, Mrs. Peterson from the boarding house, the blacksmith wiping his hands on his apron, and several others. Sheriff Mills emerged from his office as they halted, his weathered face showing rare emotion. "Miss Kingston, thank the Lord." His gaze shifted to Brock. "You found her." "She helped find herself," Brock replied, dismounting before helping Tessa down. The sheriff noticed her bandaged wrists and the state of her dress, his expression darkening. "The men who took you." "One's tied up in a cabin in the Toyabis," Brock explained. "Tucker, I believe he was called. Another one's bound near the trail. 2 more at a rendezvous point, planning to deliver a ransom demand." Mills nodded grimly. "I'll organize a posse immediately." He turned to Tessa. "Miss Kingston, are you hurt? Should I fetch the doctor?" "I'm all right, Sheriff," she assured him, though she swayed slightly on her feet. "Just tired and sore. Nothing that won't mend." Mrs. Peterson bustled forward. "You come with me, dear. I've got a hot bath waiting and fresh clothes. Doctor can see you at my place." Tessa hesitated, glancing at Brock. "I need to thank—" "Later," the older woman interrupted, taking Tessa's arm firmly. "This young man can wait until you're properly tended to." Brock nodded encouragingly. "Go on, I'll be around." As Mrs. Peterson led Tessa away, the sheriff turned to Brock. "I need details. Where exactly is this cabin? What can we expect from the remaining raiders?" For the next hour, Brock provided the sheriff and his hastily assembled posse with everything they needed to know: the location of the cabin, descriptions of the 2 remaining outlaws, their likely meeting point based on conversations Tessa had overheard. "You've earned that $50, and then some," Mills said when they'd finished. "Town council might even vote a bonus when they hear the full story." Brock waved aside the suggestion. "Just doing the job you hired me for." The sheriff studied him thoughtfully. "You planning to stick around Hamilton? Could use a man with your skills. Deputy position might open up permanent if Williams decides that broken leg is a sign he should take up something less dangerous." The offer caught Brock by surprise. Until 2 days ago, he'd been planning to move on once he'd earned enough for new supplies and perhaps a better saddle. Now, the thought of leaving Hamilton, of leaving Tessa, created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. "I'll think on it," he promised, neither accepting nor rejecting the possibility. What Brock didn't know yet was that Tessa Kingston was about to make him an offer that would change everything. An offer that would give him a reason to stay that went far beyond any deputy position. After the sheriff and posse departed, Brock led Thunder to the livery stable, ensuring the faithful gelding received extra oats and a thorough rub-down for his efforts. Then he made his way to his room at the Hamilton Hotel, where a bath, fresh clothes, and several hours of much-needed sleep restored him somewhat. Evening found him at the Rusty Nail Saloon, nursing a whiskey and declining to elaborate on his rescue mission despite curious inquiries from the other patrons. The tale would spread soon enough without his help. He was considering turning in for the night when the Batwing doors swung open and Tessa Kingston entered, causing a momentary hush in the room. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly arranged, the bandages on her wrists visible but less prominent than before. Her eyes scanned the room, finding him at his corner table. She crossed to him without hesitation, ignoring the stares of the other patrons. "Mr. Xavier, may I join you?" Brock stood immediately. "Of course." As she settled into the chair he held for her, whispers circulated through the saloon. A respectable woman like Tessa Kingston didn't enter such establishments without good reason. "You're causing a stir," Brock observed quietly, resuming his seat. "Let them talk," she replied, her chin lifting slightly. "I've never much cared for this town's opinions." The bartender approached cautiously. "Miss Kingston, can I get you something? Sarsaparilla, perhaps?" "Whiskey," she replied firmly. "Just a small one." The man's eyebrows rose, but he nodded and retreated to fill the order. "Doctor says I'm remarkably unharmed considering," Tessa told Brock when they were alone again. "The wrists will heal. Everything else is just bruises and exhaustion." "I'm glad," Brock said sincerely. "You had me worried. You hit it well." The bartender returned with her drink, placing it carefully before her before hurrying away. Tessa lifted the glass. "To my rescuer." "To your own courage," Brock countered, touching his glass to hers. They drank, Tessa coughing slightly at the burn of the alcohol. "I'm not accustomed to whiskey," she admitted, "but it seemed appropriate tonight." "A celebration of survival," Brock agreed. Tessa set her glass down, her expression becoming serious. "I never properly thanked you. The sheriff told me you refused additional payment beyond the original $50. Didn't do it for money." "Why did you do it then?" she asked, her eyes steady on his face. The directness of her gaze made prevarication impossible. "Because it was you," he said simply. Color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "The sheriff mentioned he offered you a deputy position. News travels fast in Hamilton." "Small towns," she said with a slight smile. "Are you considering it?" Brock turned his glass slowly, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. "I've been drifting a long time, never stayed anywhere more than a few months." "That doesn't answer my question." He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "I'm considering it. Depends on certain factors." Such as, such as whether there's enough reason to stay. The words hung between them, laden with meaning. Tessa drew a deep breath. I reopened the store this evening, just briefly. There was something I wanted to check. The apparent change of subject caught Brock off guard. And did you find it? She nodded. The account books. Even with the loss of the wagon and supplies, the store is doing better than I realized. Pa always said retail was about inventory and cash flow. I've been so focused on the daily operations, I hadn't seen the larger picture. Which is, Brock prompted, unsure where she was leading. I need help, Tessa said frankly. The store is growing. I can't manage it alone anymore, especially if I want to expand when the railroad comes through. I'm offering you a partnership. 25% of the business to start, with the possibility of more based on performance. You'd handle the supply runs, security, help with the heavy lifting. I'd manage the books and customer relations. Brock stared at her, momentarily speechless. Of all the possibilities he'd considered for his future, becoming a merchant had never been among them. I don't know the first thing about running a store, he pointed out. You know people. You notice details. You're honest and hard-working. Tessa leaned forward slightly. The rest can be learned. And if I'm not interested in becoming a shopkeeper, then you can take the deputy job or move on to the next town. Her voice remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes. Vulnerability, perhaps. But either way, I wanted you to know that you have options in Hamilton, reasons to stay. The implication hung unspoken between them. Brock considered her offer, turning it over in his mind. A partnership, roots in a community, working alongside Tessa daily. The idea held more appeal than he cared to admit. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully. But I need to think on it. It's not a decision to make lightly. Tessa nodded, disappointment visible briefly before her practical expression returned. Of course, take whatever time you need. She finished her whiskey and stood. I should be getting back. Mrs. Peterson will be wondering where I've gone. Brock rose as well. I'll walk you. The night air was cool and clean after the smoke-filled saloon. They walked in silence along Hamilton's main street, passing darkened storefronts and occasional lit windows. When they reached the boarding house, Tessa paused at the foot of the steps. Thank you again, she said. For everything. No need to thank me, Brock replied. She studied him in the moonlight, as though memorizing his features. Good night, Mr. Xavier. Good night, Miss Kingston. He waited until she was safely inside before continuing to his hotel, his thoughts in turmoil. The prospect of staying in Hamilton, of working with Tessa, seeing her daily, it stirred feelings he'd long suppressed. After years of drifting, the idea of belonging somewhere, to someone, was both appealing and terrifying. Sleep eluded him that night as he weighed his options. By dawn, he'd made his decision. And that decision was about to change both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. The next morning found Brock at Kingston Mercantile before opening hours. Through the window, he could see Tessa already at work, sweeping the floor and arranging displays. He watched her for a moment, struck by the simple grace of her movements, the determination evident in every gesture. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. Tessa looked up, surprise crossing her face before she moved to let him in. Mr. Xavier, she greeted him. You're out early. Brock, he reminded her. And yes, I had some thinking to do. She set aside her broom, her expression carefully neutral. And have you reached any conclusions? I have. He glanced around the store, solid shelves stocked with practical goods, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, a counter with a gleaming brass cash register. Not the future he'd imagined for himself. Yet suddenly, it seemed right. I'd like to accept your offer, the partnership. Joy flashed across her face before she composed herself, extending her hand formally. Then welcome to Kingston Mercantile, partner. Brock took her offered hand, but instead of shaking it, he held it gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. There's something else I need to make clear. Tessa's breath caught. Yes? I'm not staying just for the business, he said, his voice low. I'm staying for you. The simple declaration hung between them. Tessa's eyes widened, her hand trembling slightly in his. I hoped, she began, then stopped, gathering herself. I've never been good with words, numbers, inventory, practical things. Those I understand. But this, she gestured between them. This scares me more than raiders ever could. Scares me too, Brock admitted. Been running so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place. We could learn together, Tessa suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd like that, Brock said. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows caught in her auburn hair, creating a halo effect that momentarily stole his breath. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. When Tessa responded, her free hand moving to rest against his chest, Brock deepened the kiss, releasing her hand to draw her closer. When they finally separated, both somewhat breathless, Tessa smiled up at him. So, partner, are you ready to learn the mercantile business? Brock laughed, keeping one arm around her waist. I'm a quick study, but I think we should seal our agreement properly first. This time, when he kissed her, there was nothing tentative about it. And outside, Hamilton was waking up to a new day, a day that would see the beginning of something extraordinary between a drifter who'd finally found his home and a storekeeper who'd found her partner in every sense of the word. 1 year later, the summer sun beat down on Hamilton's main street as Brock loaded the last crate onto the wagon. Kingston and Xavier Mercantile, according to the freshly painted sign, had just received its largest shipment yet from the newly completed railroad spur. That's the last of it, he called to Tessa, who was checking items against her inventory list. She looked up with a smile, the gold band on her left hand catching the sunlight. 6 months married, and that smile still made his heart skip a beat. Perfect timing, she replied, making a final notation. We should be able to unpack everything before the store opens tomorrow. Brock wiped sweat from his brow, surveying their expanded operation with satisfaction. The mercantile now occupied 2 storefronts, with a dedicated hardware section and expanded dry goods department. Business had boomed with the railroad's arrival, just as Tessa had predicted. Hard to believe it's been a year, he remarked as she joined him by the wagon. Since I rescued you. Tessa slipped her arm through his, leaning against his shoulder briefly. I still have nightmares sometimes. I know, Brock said softly. He would wake occasionally to find her trembling beside him, haunted by memories of those terrifying days. Each time he would hold her until the fear subsided, reminding her that she was safe and that they were together. But they're less frequent now, she continued, her tone lightening. And I have much better things to dream about these days. Such as? Brock smiled, dropping a kiss on top of her head. The future, the store, the house we're building. Her hand moved to rest on her still flat stomach. The baby that will arrive this winter. Though she had told him the news 3 days ago, Brock still felt a surge of wonder and terror at the thought of becoming a father. Still getting used to that idea, he admitted. You have 6 more months, Tessa reminded him with a laugh. Plenty of time to panic properly. Not panicking, he protested, just adjusting my expectations. As am I. She grew more serious. Did you ever imagine, when you were tracking me through the wilderness, that we would end up here, Partners in every sense? Brock considered the question, remembering those desperate days of pursuit, the fear that had driven him, the moment he'd first seen her in that cabin. No, he answered honestly. But I knew even then that you were worth following anywhere. Tessa's eyes softened. And I knew, when I woke in that clearing and saw you keeping watch over me, that I'd found something I hadn't realized I was missing. A protector, Brock suggested. A partner, she corrected. Someone who saw me clearly and valued what they saw. He drew her closer, mindful of her delicate condition despite the lack of visible evidence. Best decision I ever made, accepting your business proposition. And the personal proposition that came with it? Tessa teased. Even better, Brock assured her, bending to kiss her properly, regardless of who might see them on Hamilton's Main Street. As they drove through the growing town toward their home on the outskirts, Brock reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From Confederate cavalry to Texas cowboy, Wyoming deputy to Montana trapper, and finally to Nevada merchant and husband. It wasn't the life he had envisioned for himself. But as he glanced at the remarkable woman beside him, he couldn't imagine wanting any other. "What are you thinking about?" Tessa asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "How sometimes the thing you've been looking for finds you when you least expect it," he replied. Tessa leaned against his shoulder contentedly. "I'm glad you were the one who found me." "I'm glad you left a trail worth following," Brock countered, squeezing her hand gently. Together, they continued toward home, their shared future stretching before them like a promising horizon, no longer drifting, but firmly anchored in the life they were building together. 5 years later, the Kingston and Xavier Mercantile stood as Hamilton's most prosperous business, its two-story facade dominating the main street. Inside, shelves were stocked with everything from basic necessities to luxuries previously unavailable in the growing town. Behind the main counter, 4-year-old Benjamin Xavier carefully counted nails into small paper bags under his father's watchful eye. "That's right, Ben," Brock encouraged. 10 in each bag." The boy's tongue protruded slightly in concentration, his auburn hair, so like his mother's, falling across his forehead. 1, 2, 3. He counted deliberately, placing each nail with careful precision. From the office doorway, Tessa observed the scene with a smile, their 1-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, asleep against her shoulder. The children had been named for her parents, continuing a legacy that might otherwise have been lost when her father died. "Mr. Hollister is here for his monthly order," she announced softly, mindful of the sleeping child. Brock nodded. "Ben, you want to help Mr. Hollister. He has a ranch bigger than 10 of our stores." The boy's eyes widened with interest. "Can I, Pa?" "If you're polite and listen carefully," Brock instructed, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. As Ben scampered off to greet their most substantial customer, Brock moved to join Tessa, gently taking Elizabeth from her arms. The baby stirred briefly before settling against her father's broad chest. "Order from San Francisco arrived this morning," Tessa reported. "Everything we requested, plus those catalogs for the ladies' sewing circle." "Good, and the new safes being installed tomorrow. Sheriff thinks it's wise with the bank shipments coming through more frequently." Brock nodded, swaying slightly to keep the baby asleep. Hard to believe how much has changed. 5 years ago, Hamilton was barely hanging on. "And we weren't much better," Tessa reminded him. "A traumatized storekeeper and a drifter with no fixed address. Now look at us." Brock's tone was lightly mocking, but his pride was evident. "Pillars of the community." The former tracker had taken to business with surprising aptitude, his natural understanding of people and instinct for fairness serving him well in commercial dealings. Tessa laid a hand on his arm. "We've built something good here, something that will last." Later that evening, With the children asleep and the store closed, Tessa and Brock sat on their small balcony overlooking Hamilton's main street. The town had grown considerably, with gas lamps now illuminating the boardwalks and new buildings rising where vacant lots had once stood. "Sheriff Mills is retiring next month," Brock mentioned, sipping his whiskey. Asked if I'd be interested in running for the position. Tessa raised an eyebrow. "Are you?" Told him I already had a job I liked just fine. Brock smiled at her over his glass. "Though I did suggest Deputy Wilson. He's got a good head on his shoulders." "Wise choice," Tessa agreed. "I'm not sure I'd want to be married to the sheriff anyway. Too many late nights and gunfights." "As opposed to the peaceful life of a merchant," Brock teased. "Remember last month when Mrs. Putnam and Mrs. Hollister nearly came to blows over that bolt of French lace?" Tessa laughed, the sound carrying softly into the evening air. "Fair point, though I maintain that retail disputes are less likely to involve bullets." They fell into comfortable silence, watching as the last colors of sunset faded from the sky. Brock reached for Tessa's hand, his thumb tracing the gold band he'd placed there. "You ever wonder how things might have turned out if your wagon hadn't been raided that day?" he asked. "If we'd just continued passing each other in town with barely a word." "Sometimes," Tessa considered the question. "But then I remember something my father used to say, that life has a way of putting us exactly where we need to be, even if the journey there is difficult. Wise man, your father. He would have liked you," Tessa said softly. "Trusted you too, I think. High praise." Brock lifted her hand to his lips. "I've tried to be worthy of his daughter." "You've succeeded," Tessa assured him. "More than succeeded." As night settled fully over Hamilton, they remained on the balcony, hands clasped, contemplating the town they had helped build and the life they had created together. From tragedy had come triumph. From pursuit had come partnership. From rescue had come love that deepened with each passing year. Neither could have predicted on that fateful day, when raiders attacked a lone woman's wagon on the road to Hamilton, that they were setting in motion events that would transform not only their lives, but an entire community. Yet looking back, it seemed somehow inevitable, as though all paths had been leading to this moment, this life, this enduring love. "Come to bed," Tessa said eventually, rising and drawing her husband to his feet. "We have inventory to complete tomorrow." Brock smiled, following her inside. "Yes, ma'am, whatever you say." Her laughter, warm and intimate, was the most beautiful sound he had ever tracked across the wilderness of Nevada, and continued to follow willingly every day of their shared life. If you enjoyed this story of courage, rescue, and unexpected love on the Nevada frontier, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Would you have left breadcrumbs like Tessa did? What would you have done in Brock's position? Share your thoughts below, and stay tuned for more incredible true stories of the American West.